What's up, everybody? So I wanted to make a video talking about concepts. This is a little bit based on a blog post that I wrote like a little while back on my blog, which I'll put a link to in the description. That blog post was called Writing Seed of the Black Oak, High Concept, Low Concept, No Concept. This isn't going to just be a rehash of that article, so like if you want to know what I say specifically in the article, go read it, because this video is going to be slightly different. But I'm just kind of riffing on the theme, right? So, as I mentioned in my last video, I have a fantasy novel coming out later this year called Seed of the Black Oak, and it has got me wanting to talk more about the writing process and just generally about like fiction and fantasy and storytelling and that kind of stuff. I have been a fiction writer since I was 12 years old. I've had very limited success in that until now. I have a couple of like shorter, more YA works that have been published, but this is like my first adult thing, and it's my first fantasy story, so I'm really psyched for it. Anyways, so if you're not familiar with the term high concept, right, this is the kind of stuff that I think any writer of like pulp fiction or popular fiction or speculative fiction, this is the kind of stuff that most of us, I think, strive for. High concept basically means it is a story that can be summed up in like one sentence, and the person that you are that's like listening to you, the person you're giving that one sentence to, can like immediately just get it, right? So a lot of movies are very easy to kind of get the idea, right? So like the movie Alien, it's a slasher in space where the killer is an alien, right? You're immediately like, bam, I got it. I get what that movie is like trying to do. A lot of high concepts can be like X meets Y, or like something in space, right? Where it's like a twist on a familiar idea. And you just kind of immediately like start imagining and conjuring images in your head of what that story is about. So when I think about where I get concepts and ideas for stories, I always try to come up with something high concept because they're very easily marketable. The problem is that if you try to force them, like you can't force them, right? They kind of have to just come to you or like be developed as you're working on other stories, and then you kind of get the idea for a way to make it high concept. You can't just like, if you sit and just try to bang out a list of like 20 high concept ideas, most of them will be stinky poo-poo. So and they're also like coming up with ideas like that, like you're in like a boardroom pitch meeting and then trying to write novels out of it, is a recipe for stories that you are not passionate about. The writing will feel forced, and it just, it might not even come at all. So, I will give an example of a high concept idea I did come up with, which was paranormal romance, but the two leads, the two romantic leads, one of them is an ordinary woman, and the male romantic lead that she's supposed to get with is a demon who's possessing her. So the high concept would be paranormal romance between a woman and the demon possessing her mind. I thought that was really cool. And I set out to write it. However, it ended up, I actually have that manuscript finished, at least, second draft-ish. It's not finished. It's not coming out or anything. I'm still working on finding an agent for it. But it ended up not being a high-concept novel in the end, because I had to really, I had to push the romance to the background. And the reason for that is just because it's like a very weird power dynamic, and I didn't want to write a quote-unquote problematic romance. So I felt like any romance that needed to develop between characters like that needed to be like a much slower burn. So the romance aspect was pushed to the background, and it became more about like a buddy, almost like a buddy story where they're just learning to like work together and be friends. But that's not really high concept anymore. It's just like a demonic possession story but where the human character and the demon possessing them like eventually learn to work together and be friends. So I wouldn't really call that high concept. It started as a high concept idea, but then in the telling, the high concept kind of got limited a little bit. So when it comes to like where do you actually get ideas from when you don't get that kind of bolt from the blue high concept story, is I really recommend, and what I try to do is starting with characters. If you don't have like a really juicy situation like the one I just mentioned, starting with an interesting character is, I think, the best way to do it. So like a low concept story would be one that is more based on character interactions and character drama, and there, you know, of course there is a plot, and it can be a very pulpy kind of mainstream plot. It just doesn't have that like instantly recognizable concept that you can pitch it and promote it with. When you start with characters, it really helps, I think, get the action of the story like moving faster, because if you can visualize the character you're starting with, then it's pretty easy, I feel like, to figure out what their motivations are, and from there, like, a story will naturally just kind of develop. If you follow this character, the key thing, though, is that your character has to be motivated. This probably needs to be a video all on its own, but the key to writing a good character, and I don't mean good as in, like, they're a good guy and they're moral, but, like, a good character that people will want to read about, is your character needs to be motivated. Your character needs to have a thing that they want and are actively taking steps to achieve. There's a lot of variation in there, and if you have like multiple important characters in your story, this can look a little different, and you can like play around with it more. But in general, for like mainstream commercial like pulp fiction, like, which is what I try to write, you want characters that are active and motivated. So my book, Seed of the Black Oak, for example, it started with a character named Epi, who is a kind of mercenary warrior in a Celtic-inspired fantasy world. She's a commoner, and what I knew about her at the beginning of the story was that she was out for revenge. That she had a lover when she was a teenager who she thought was dead, and she had ran away from home so she could develop the skills necessary to come back and get revenge. It was a vengeance-motivated story. And then the twist that I thought would, you know, when she gets back to get her revenge, she finds out that her lover is actually still alive. So that puts a little bit of a plot twist in it, and she has to balance kind of her hatred and her vengeance with the knowledge that she didn't actually lose everything she thought she did, so that calls into question her whole like motive for revenge. But it's really started with the character and what she wanted. I had an idea of what she looked like in my head. I had an idea of her skills and personality. I wanted her to be this like fantasy James Bond like character who was very cold and calculating, and kind of executed her missions with like brutal efficiency, and then kind of peeled back those layers as the story went on. So started with a character, I got a whole novel out of it, and I think that unless you get one of those really great high concept ideas, which if you do, like, what are you waiting for? Write that. But you can't just sit and wait for those brilliant ideas to just strike you. Start with characters, come up with some cool character ideas, think of, you know, an OC that you really want to write about, and just start writing about them. I think, at least in my experience, the writing takes care of itself once you start there. All right. Happy writing.